Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today here. Thank you to those who are joining online as well. I am Katerina Tassi. I am a data protection lawyer. I'm specializing in children's privacy, and I am a senior associate at Bird and Bird. I'm based in London. And just to introduce my co-speakers, I'm very delighted to be joined today by Julie Dawson, who is the Chief Policy and Regulatory Officer at Yachty. And I'm sure all of you know Yachty, a leading provider in the field of age assurance. And I'm sure many of you know Julie as well, who is an authoritative voice in digital identity, ethics, and governance. So I'm very glad that we have Julie with us here today, so that she can give us like very practical insight, because I know that she's been in this field like for many years, before it was cool. And I'm also very glad to be joined by my colleague, Shona Joyce, who is also a children's privacy expert. She's an associate at Bird and Bird's Dublin team. So it will be great to get like your views on some challenging GDPR points, I would say. So to explain what the session is about, we will be discussing certain accountability obligations and accountability considerations, both for age assurance providers and also for the customers of their services. And I know that accountability has many layers and many aspects, so we could be discussing this for hours. But given that we have like less than an hour available, we will focus on 2, 3 key points. And before we delve into the more specific accountability points, we will just have an overview of what solutions are currently available on the market and some practical considerations for organizations that are looking to use an age assurance solution and they're not sure where to start from. So before I start firing questions to Shona and Julie, I think it's useful to spend a few minutes to set the context a bit. And of course, you are attending an age assurance summit. I'm sure that like all of you know that age assurance is a hot topic at the moment, but I think it's also useful uh, to discuss the regulatory background, to see how we've reached a point today where we have an age assurance summit. We have a conference that is dedicated to age assurance, whereas the landscape, let's say 6 years ago, when the GDPR started to apply, was very different. So from a data protection perspective, at least, children's privacy and age assurance is today a regulatory priority for many regulators in Europe and in the UK as well, for the ICO, the UK Data Protection Regulator. The background to this is that although the GDPR does not contain explicit provisions regarding carrying out age assurance, there are references to children's data meriting specific protection in the recitals. There are provisions around parental consent for users under the age of consent in the context of providing online services, but they're not specific age assurance provisions. So against this background, back in 2020, the UK Data Protection Regulator, the ICO, issued the Age Appropriate Design Code, or Children's Code, which includes a set of standards that online service providers have to meet if their services are likely to be accessed by children. And this children's code it was the first attempt to have a more detailed commentary on age assurance in connection with the GDPR. And the ICO continues to be active in this area. They issued an opinion, specifically an opinion on age assurance back in 2021, I think, which was updated just this January. Um, and the Children's Code has been an inspiration and an influence for other regulators as well. Of course, as Shona will also talk about, in 2021, the Irish regulator, the DPC, issued the fundamentals for a child-oriented approach to data processing, which is very much aligned with the Children's Code. And it also contains sections on age assurance in connection with the GDPR. And there are also other regulators have also been active on this topic. We have guidance from the CNIL, we have guidance from the Spanish Data Protection Authority, the AEPD, and apart from this guidance, we've also started seeing enforcement action in the in relation to children's privacy, which touches upon issues of age assurance. And Shona will talk about this in a bit as well. We've had a decision from the ICO against TikTok about a year ago, which also discusses age assurance issues. And in September 2023, we had a decision, the final decision from the Irish DPC, again against TikTok, and we have an interesting EDPB analysis there around age assurance, and I think this shows that age assurance is also a challenging area for regulators as well. So I guess this was a very long introduction to say that age assurance is a regulatory priority, and it will continue to it will continue to be one over the next period. And I will not mention other online safety legislation that also introduces age assurance requirements. And as you are aware, age assurance is an evolving area. This is recognized by regulators. Regulators also recognize that the GDPR does not set a specific method for carrying out age assurance. This is up to organizations to determine what is appropriate, depending on their processing activities. So this is another layer of complexity, and it shows that it is so important to get this right. So we will be focusing today on age assurance solutions that are provided by third parties, by age assurance providers. Of course, some online services build their own solutions, but I think that for the majority of services, as Julie will explain, going through a third-party solution is the most feasible option. Sona, with this background and the long introduction, could you please give us an overview of the age assurance, the most common types of third-party age assurance solutions that that are currently available in the market? Because I think this will help us discuss like particular challenges for different types of solutions.
Thanks so much, Katerina, and thanks everyone for being with us today. I suppose, as you're all probably well aware, there's a number of third-party age assurance solutions that are available in the market, and which we're seeing much more of in practice. And I suppose just as a kind of precursor, and as I'm sure everyone will be aware, is that self-declaration is not in and of itself age assurance. It can be when used in combination with other mechanisms, and nor is age assurance as part of parental consent. So that would be, for example, assessing whether someone is over a particular age, such as 25 or 30, to indicate that they'd be old enough to kind of give parental consent. So with all that in mind, the kind of most common mechanisms that we're kind of seeing in the marketplace are facial age estimation, So that estimates the age of the individual using a facial image to uniquely identify that person as a particular age, with that image being deleted upon completion of the assessment. Generally, we see that that kind of places users in bands, so under 13s, 13 to 17s, and then under 18 or over 18. The kind of interesting, more nascent trend around biometric processing is the use of voice analysis to estimate a person's age. And I would kind of caveat that to say, obviously, that that is that's in the very early stages of development, and they would tend at the moment not to reach those kind of higher levels of accuracy that they'd be used to make them more appropriate for kind of higher risk scenarios. And then there's hard identifiers, which would be passport ID, with the passport ID scan of the relevant government issued ID and a live photo or video being uploaded so that the live face is matched to the ID. And typically we would see those for the kind of higher risk situations for regulated and other kind of age restricted services. There's also the digital ID wallet, which is like a digital ID wallet functionality, using the wallet app in your phone to kind of add one or more documents so that you can kind of create a reusable digital ID app to prove that you're over a particular age, such as 18. Um, Less typically, and I suppose one that certainly in my practice we would see more limited to parental verification would be around credit card checks to check that a user is over the age of 18. And that can also be used as regards children, with a child kind of generally being defined as a person under 18. And then finally, which is really kind of the topic of this session, is the use of third-party data sources to ascertain the age of the individual against those data sources. And those would usually be quite varied in range. We'd see, for example, mobile provider checks and other database checks, such as government databases, data broker databases, public information online, banking information, or voter registration records, to name kind of a few. So there's a good few options available in the market, and there's certainly a fast pace of change.
Thanks so much for this overview, very comprehensive. Julie, turning to you, as Sean explained, there is a range of solutions currently available. And perhaps organizations that want to implement age assurance solutions might find it a bit overwhelming where they should start from. So what's your advice? How can organizations determine what solution is best for them, what factors are in play, and actually where should they start from?
Thank you. So as Katarina described, I think the thing that we can bring to today is the fact that we have helped organizations to do over 650 million age checks over the last year or so. So that's what I'm going to try and channel to answer that. For a whole range of organizations, from sort of government looking at age of victims and perpetrators in CSAM, through to social platforms looking at, is someone 13 to 17, looking at someone, is someone over 13 or over 18. But yeah, I think the key element really is a bit like learning to swim. You can't learn to swim without getting in the water. And what we find with this is that organizations need to really think of what regime is it that they are most specifically looking to comply with, and look at which geography and which service flow. So, literally hone it down slightly. If you're a global platform operating in lots of countries, better to start small and look specifically at what is their key regulatory driver, based on their risk profile and their risk assessment, and what they think the demographic of their users is, to then actually go down and think, well, what geography might we do some testing in, and what might be a specific use case? So if you're a gaming platform, a classic one might be, we have live chat. Maybe that's the sort of area that is a higher risk. Or we have a service, for example, with Facebook dating. We definitely want that to be for over 18. So what are those risk inflection points that are higher? And then to actually think through with more granular detail, but bringing together different departments in the company. It's really rare that one head in one company can really do this. And we classically find we might have about 8 different departments if it's a big global company, from product through to operations, data protection, the general counsel, and. It's not one head that can bring this together. And then when they've picked a geography, picked a use case, picked where in the flow that might go, they have to think through, well, what will our KPIs be? You know, is there a specific drop-off rate that we need to really monitor? Do we need to look at the error rates? What languages will this need to be deployed in? Are there other accessibility elements? Could we do some testing with staff and sort of friends and family, or are we actually going to do this in the wild? And do we know what devices people tend to use in that context? So that helps to really hone it down. And then if, say, they were looking at a certain geography in Europe, there might be different methods that are available in different jurisdictions. So there's not an equal penetration, for example, of mobile phone network data. The German regulator, for instance, wouldn't allow that to be used. In some countries, you haven't got great credit reference data, so that's just not going to be an option. What we offer is a range of options, and through a portal with one integration, they can integrate 7, 8, 9 methods and pick which are the ones that work in that jurisdiction, and then do some A/B testing. That could be time-bound over a specific period. But that then enables them, as I said, to get in the water, to have some experience, to have some data, and to actually be able to have a live discussion with different departments in the company and actually think it through in a tangible, practical basis. And over many, many implementations now, that's what we found is what really gets things galvanized. So hopefully that's a helpful, practical, rubber hitting the road example.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's very practical, and I think it is very helpful for organizations who want to start building their thinking and strategy around age assurance. So, Shona, from a legal perspective, what can organizations think of to determine what age assurance solution or a combination of solutions is appropriate, is right for them? The GDPR talks about the age of digital consent, which is not harmonized as we know across the EU. It can range between 13 and 16 years. Also, it establishes generally a risk-based approach. It so I understand, as Julie also said, risk will be a very relevant factor here. So what is your view? Could you talk us through this and explain what are the main considerations from a GDPR perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Katerina. So, one of the ways that we approach this in practice, certainly from an Irish perspective, the fundamentals note that the age of digital consent, which is 16 in Ireland, it can be used as a marker for online services, to consider kind of the nature, the design of their services, and how to make them age appropriate for users. But kind of coming back to what Julie said, and in terms of kind of risk assessments and analysis, that doesn't always mean that it's not carte blanche, that the age of digital consent is always kind of an appropriate minimum age. But it is a good starting point. And then, you can kind of take a step back and consider, are there higher risks associated with a particular setting or service, that may be a higher age than the age of digital consent should be applied? And then in other circumstances, are the risks actually lower, such that kind of a lower age can be ascribed and can be justified in a particular context? With that in mind, and what I think is really important, is that appropriate risk assessments are carried out as regards each kind of setting or service. Now, that can obviously be quite difficult, as it is quite granular, but it's this idea of having kind of risk at the forefront of your mind, as regards particular uses of a child's personal data. And Katerina, you had previously touched on the kind of regulatory activity that we've seen in this area from both the ICO and the DPC, particularly relating to the separate TikTok decisions. And kind of read in combination, I think one of the key takeaways, and which is something that I touched on earlier from those decisions, is kind of almost a regulatory confirmation, I suppose, that the use of an age gate or a self-declaration as a means of preventing underage access to a platform that would have risks kind of comparable to what we'd see um, with the likes of TikTok or any of those other large online platforms will infringe one or more provisions of the GDPR. Now, I think one of the most interesting takeaways from those decisions, particularly the DPC as regards its own decision last September, was that it didn't endorse any specific type or method or solution of age assurance per se. I think there was quite a conscious effort on the part of the DPC in that decision to say there's no set method of age assurance solutions to be deployed. Rather, it's something that the organisation itself is going to have to ascertain for themselves by reference to their controller responsibilities under Article 24 of the GDPR, and also that principle of data protection by design and by default that comes through in Article 25. And I think that really comes back, Julie, to what you were saying in terms of involving different teams, because data protection by design and by default, that really starts from the development of the product up, so that it's kind of infused in kind of every stage of the product's development. And I suppose kind of stepping through certainly the DPC's logic in that perspective is they said there's no specification in Article 24 and Article 25 around that principle of data protection by design and by default and controller responsibilities as to kind of a particular measure that should be used to ensure age verification or age assurance. And they also made a point to kind of say, look, the area of age assurance is very much still under development, and there's no as yet accepted or stipulated industry standards, and there's no kind of absolute method of age assurance. So it's really only falling to the DPC and other regulators to decide if the measures employed are appropriate, having regard to your controller responsibilities and that principle of data protection by design and by default. I think that's the real starting point for organizations when they're beginning to look at this.
Thanks very much. That's very useful background. And I know GDPR compliance can be like very overwhelming, but I think it's a great summary. If we turn now to age assurance providers themselves and their own accountability and compliance considerations and practices, one of one of the first things that uh, an age assurance provider, like all other organizations that are subject to the GDPR, would have to think about is their role under the GDPR. If they act as a controller with their as a joint controller with their customers, or if they act as a processor when providing their services. So now, could you please explain the approaches that you've seen, like perhaps client taking in this respect, and how do they approach the controllership issue?
Thanks, Katarina. Yeah, I think it's certainly an interesting one because I don't think it's something that has been, tested per se in the regulatory context anyway. And I think that is something which is certainly being borne out in practice because we're currently seeing kind of a variety of different approaches in the market, which I do think has to do with the kind of pace of change and development in this area, and to some extent the kind of various different solutions that are available on the market, which I touched on a bit earlier. And with all that in mind, I think that the key thing to do, whether you're the customer or the provider, is to come back to your first principles with GDPR and the classification of the parties involved. And what that really kind of boils down to is thinking about, if you're a provider, your role in the processing and how that might hit on the role of controller, joint controller, processor, in terms of how those roles are defined and kind of approached in the GDPR and the kind of interpretation of those roles with regulatory guidance. Um, so in kind of very practical terms, that'll be things like what's the level of involvement of the processor in the processing, which party holds the decision-making power in relation to the processing. Does the provider only process personal data on the direction of the organization, the customer, or does it have separate or shared decision-making functionalities itself? And kind of, I suppose, coming back to that regulatory approach and probably reflective of the more kind of varied approach that we're seeing to this, is that the ICO opinion on age assurance doesn't explore this particular topic in detail, and neither do the DPC fundamentals. But I would say, kind of implicit in the, certainly in the fundamentals and the your platform, your responsibility principle, is that idea that the organization or the customer itself is responsible for proving that it has effective age verification, age assurance measures in place. And that to me would seem to lean towards the notion that the provider is processor or at least a joint controllership position. And similarly, the ICO's expectations for age assurance under its children's code that are set out in that opinion on age assurance would also seem to point to that processor joint controller position, in that they're very much drafted towards the management of risk and the application of data protection principles that are set out in the GDPR, which would point towards a kind of assumption, or maybe implicit assumption, that the organization, the customer, is taking on a controllership role.
Great. Thanks very much. And just to add to this, the role of the age assurance provider will actually determine what their obligations are under the GDPR. If they act as a controller, they will be subject to the full set of obligations. If they are acting as a processor, they will be subject to a more limited set of obligations. But again, they will still have to enable their customers to ensure compliance with the GDPR. Uh, Also, it will determine what data protection provisions are appropriate to include in their contracts with their customers. So, so it has, although some people may think it's more like a theoretical analysis, it actually has like very practical considerations. And I'm thinking there are 2 points in particular that age assurance providers would have to think about if they're acting as a controller. One is transparency, and the second one is establishing a legal basis. And for transparency, I know we had like a great session earlier today, transparency and age assurance. Specifically, if the provider is acting as a controller, they would need to ensure that they can meet all these transparency obligations. And this could be particularly challenging if they don't have a direct relationship with the individuals who assure their age through their services. So this is something that age assurance providers would have to look into. And then just to very briefly touch on the point of legal basis, they will have age assurance providers will have to establish a legal basis under the GDPR, but these will not necessarily coincide with the legal basis that their customers would go with. For example, we've seen clients taking the approach that their age assurance solutions are necessary for them to comply with their legal obligations. But this, for an age assurance provider, would not necessarily work because they would not have a direct obligation under the GDPR or another legislation to carry out this type of processing. Equally, consent could be challenging because of parental consent and the difficulties around this. So this is a point that organizations need to examine very carefully. So Julie, just to get your views on this, how do you approach this issue of controllership and potentially like legal basis? And I know that Yoti offers like different solutions. So I guess your position may differ depending on the solution that you offer, right?
Thank you very much, Katrina. Yeah, so absolutely, the legal basis varies. We have a whole range of different approaches. Um, so say, for instance, you looked at, well, and just to recap, every one of them has to be data minimized. So as a third party, we're always providing just, say, a 13 to 17, an over 13, an over 18, an under 18, and always a data minimized approach. And it's still, I find it incredible in 2024 that we are, you know, reminding people always at that point, we're not sending entire documents to organizations, we're just sending the plus 18, the 13 to 17, the data minimized element. Um, and the approach that we use the most, where we see if we offer consumers several approaches side by side, is the facial age estimation in about 80% of cases across sectors. And that's offered on a software as a service basis, so in the flow of the relying party. So in that instance, we are a data processor. So what we're doing there, we're detecting, is this a live face, doing an analysis, the image is instantly deleted. So the crucial element is there's no unique recognition, there's no unique authentication. So there we are the data processor. And what we specifically do is describe all the accuracy, the bias, have it independently reviewed, that the image is instantly deleted, describe the origin of the data set, etc. Let me take another instance, which would be using a reusable digital identity app. So Yoti is one of many organizations that offers both reusable digital identity and also the one-off transactional identity. And from there, we can just share an over 18 or a 13 to 17, say, where that is applicable. And in that instance, it's different because we are a controller for when somebody uses their reusable digital identity app. So just for those who might not have set one up on their phone, you're downloading an app from the internet. In the UK, that could be a Yoti, a post office, a Lloyd's. You're adding a document, you're taking a selfie, we create a 5-digit PIN, we shard all the attributes, give you the key on the secure module of your device, and after that, you can just share an over 18 with Muzz, the Muslim dating app, for instance. So in that instance, it's a different position. So we are the data controller in that instance, but it's time bound because once the customer, say Muslim, dating app Muzz, requests that age attribute via that app and we facilitate the share, then Muzz, the Muslim dating app, becomes the controller and then Yoti the processor. So you go from one position to another. And I remember discussing this with Ruth probably many, many moons ago. And it's something that is an additional nuance. We also work, for example, with some mobile phone network operators, and they're very insistent that they act as a controller for some aspects of processing. So again, that is a different position. I would say across the board, one of the things that we are always looking at is what is the new guidance that is coming out, because this is not static. And we have to keep looking at what are those precedents and continue to have those discussions. I'd say that's even more important in the US, where you've got, you know, the BIPA, and you've got laws in different states. So it's an ongoing discussion, and one that I think we need to keep alive too.
And yes, it's very good to have this insight to see how you approach this issue, and ultimately to see that this depends on the solution, on the specifics of the processing activities and the extent of the involvement of the age assurance provider in determining the purposes and the means of processing. If we now move to a different topic, as this area of age assurance technology and age assurance solutions evolves, we see, Julie, we see certification schemes on this topic gaining like more ground. We see more and more age assurance providers going down this route of getting certified. For example, in the UK, we have the age check certification scheme, which provides different like options depending on the type of the solution. And I know that Yacht in particular has many accreditations. So could you talk us through this process um, to give us your view on the benefits of going through this route, to and given your experience to perhaps explain if you think that there are things that could be done differently or if there is like room for improvement here.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, it's a whole alphabet soup in terms of certifications, and it would probably take me at least 5 or 6 lines to list all the different acronyms. But absolutely, I think both on the data responsibility side and on the cybersecurity, there's a range of different things. So just as a hygiene factor, any large multinational that we will engage with will want to know from the cybersecurity perspective that our house is in order. So there, one of the classic regs and the certifications is SOC 2, which is essentially a cybersecurity accreditation. But specifically looking at age assurance and looking at data minimized age assurance, at the moment, the certification that's been around for about 4 or 5 years is one that was set up in the UK. It was set up as a publicly available specification back in 2018 for the Digital Economy Act Part 3, and it's a catchy name, the PAS 1296 2018. But that is about to be replaced by a couple of others. So the IEEE certification is an international age standard, the 2089.1. And hopefully next year we will also have the ISO accreditation. What then has to happen is how organizations are reviewed against those. So we're reviewed annually at the moment against the PAS 1296 2018, and soon we'll be reviewed probably against one or both of those other ones, as well as the SOC 2, as well as some ISO, some quality certifications. But then in addition to that, you'll have country-specific regs that have been around for a lot longer. So in Germany, they have had an approach that's been around for about a decade through the German regulatory body, the KGM, and the co-regulatory body, the FSM. Germany's quite different. They've got what they call a raster, a list of 100 approaches which have gone through review, and you're good to go if you get on the KGM raster for specific utilizations in Germany. Separately, the FSM, and Martin Drexler spoke in one of the parallel rooms, can review approaches and provide a seal of approval. You have 3 experts that might do an 18-month review and then come up with a specific seal of approval. And that would just operate in Germany. Going forwards, we're seeing some other countries, so for example, Canada, looking at something specifically for Canada. And sometimes that's because they can't wait for the ISO or the IEEE, and they're saying, look, we want something now, and we want something in our country. Hopefully, however, across the board, we will start to get cohesion. And I think that's where the role of the Global Online Safety Regulators Network is really encouraging, and the cohesion across the data protection regulators working jointly together. Because if I'm a relying party, I'm a small gaming company, I would like to know that this organization I'm working with has ticked all the boxes and is good to go in potentially 190 countries around the world. And if I was a small competitor to Yoti just starting out, it's really hard to get accredited with, 50 different acronyms of certifications in different countries. So hopefully the great work that's been spearheaded by ACCS with the ISO, and also the work on the IEEE that was spearheaded through the 5 Rights body, looking at age-appropriate design, will coalesce. And hopefully with a fair wind in the next year or so, we will all be looking at those international standards. So that's the direction of travel, but it's building on the heritage from the PAS 1296 2018. And still under the hood, those are likely referred to the cybersecurity standards such as SOC 2, maybe quality management under the hood. And you'll get to more granularity still for certain methods. So if I'm looking at facial age estimation, it might also refer to how good is the minimum level that a liveness detection needs to be. And what about an anti-injection attack? So there are other things under the hood for each specific method that might needed to be added as well. So that's why we've got 220 tracks over 5 days, and why this continues to be something with quite a bit of detail. But yeah, we're moving forwards.
That's a lot of work to keep up with. Yeah. And how do you see customers approaching like certification? Do you think that over time the weight that customers give to certification will increase? And perhaps besides certification, are there other factors that customers value a lot when they're looking at an age assurance provider's practices?
So the thing I forgot to mention on the previous one was I think the interoperability is one of the key areas. So looking at transparency, looking at interoperability, looking at accessibility is really, really key. We're a member of the Age Verification Providers Association that's worked with the EU on the EU consent project, trying to get the first interoperable work. And there's another parallel session earlier on the PKI approach. And there'll be another session tomorrow where you can see how the EU consent is evolving, how age assurance providers are working together and building on the work that was in the first EU consent and moving that forwards. But absolutely, I think that our customers are looking at, well, if I'm a small company, how can you take this headache away from me? And actually tokenized interoperable approaches will be something that will help overall. Organisers will want to know that if you take part in such a body, such as an EU consent, or if you are an age assurance provider, have you got these hygiene factors in terms of, is your data responsibility and your cybersecurity, is there a clear mark which you have achieved? Accessibility is really important for lots of companies globally. And there's something called the WCAG 2.1A and AA, which are what levels of accessibility you get to. And that's things like, if you're visually impaired, auditory impaired, motor skills, epileptic, a whole range of different elements that could make it a challenge for you to get online. How do we as organizations, how are our services pegged against those? So we as an organisation are working towards those guidelines, and those will be the sort of things that the standards will point to. How accessible are they? But then also things like languages supported. And as an organisation, how transparent are you overall? Is it in plain English, what you're offering? Can you see under the hood how it's been built? How easy is it to integrate? And is it flexible behind the scenes? Can you offer a range of solutions? Is it flexible in terms of, for example, buffers? Can you support A/B testing? And how do you enable an organization or a platform to scale? That could be scaling in volume, scaling across geographies. So I think overall, the industry is working jointly through the trade body to look at how we operate interoperably, how we meet the standards. All of the industry members that are APRA members have been taking part in the standards development. And I'd say, we're looking to make it more straightforward to help platforms be able to build age-appropriate solutions. And hopefully all rowing in the same direction.
That's a good mix of factors. So thanks very much for giving us this overview. I'd like us to focus a bit on solutions that use third-party sources. And Shona described in the beginning that some solutions rely on checking data against third-party databases, and we'll talk about the legal and due diligence challenges for these solutions in a bit. Shona will talk us through this. But firstly, I would like to hear more about the practical challenges of these solutions, both for age assurance providers and also for their customers. So, for example, challenges in terms of coverage, in terms of whether these solutions would be relevant and appropriate for checking the age of users who are under 18. So it will be very interesting to hear your views on this before we delve into the more legal details.
Sure, with pleasure. Happy to help there. I'd say across all of this, the key element really is how do we offer consumers choice? And how there's not one approach that will fit in every country. But then what can people access? So at the most basic level, there's over 1 billion people on the planet that do not own an identity document. And then there's a chunk more people for a certain use case might not feel comfortable using a certain document. So if I'm in a certain country and I'm going on a gay dating site, I might not want to use my government issued ID. So there are things that are important for regulators, civil society and organizations to consider around the choice angle, to look at accessibility, to look at transparency, look at level of friction, look at the penetration of what methods are available. And there's really clearly a very different set of methods that are available once you're over 18 than under 18. So all of us will know you probably didn't get your first credit card till you were over 18. You don't get your driving license until you're old enough to learn to drive. It might vary a little country by country, but very rarely under the age of 16, often 18, will you be given the ability, will you be able to get a driving license? Things like credit reference history. You're not going to be buying that house in most instances unless you're a Harry Potter film star before you're over, your 20s, because you wouldn't be able to have that sort of a credit history. So lots of those third-party databases, you won't be listed on them until you're an adult. So things like credit reference agencies also vary hugely in geography around the world. Some countries just don't have credit reference agency type data. Mobile phone network operators, again, the penetration of those databases and the ability to say, this is definitely a child account, this is definitely an adult account, is something that regulators are still considering. And then some things might be knowledge-based facts, and regulators historically might have thought it was fine to do a name, age, date of birth check, but actually, if that's a knowledge-based check, how easy is that to be shared across a whole bunch of friends in the classroom? Oh, Uncle Fred is Fred Smith at 42 Acacia Avenue, and he was born in, 1968. That's the sort of thing that could be very easily shared. So regulators are now at the stage of starting to look at what of those degrees of circumvention versus what is accessible and what is proportionate. And different regulators will land in different positions on each of these. And as organizations that are aggregating these different methods, it's up to us to think, well, we have to offer choice, because it's not in our gift to decide what a certain regulator deems is okay and is proportionate. So we need to offer a range of different choices. I think it was interesting listening to Michael Murray from the ICO earlier, in terms of the approach in the UK was thinking about sandboxing and thinking about what are the new methods that are evolving. In other countries, there are other approaches as to how they're looking at what methods are deemed to be acceptable, and sometimes proposing solutions. But overall, I think there's now, through events such as those that we're taking part in this week, a growing awareness of what are the range of options. And we're starting to see a little bit more under the hood as to when do we think we need a re-authentication? And then starting to ponder, well, how often should that be? Should it be that you can set up an account and it lasts for 1 month, 3 months, a year? I know we don't get any younger, but how easy is it to share that account? So these are the types of things that when you're looking at third-party data sources, that as organizations, we have to consider what are the range of options that are available, but also how good are they? And within the standards bodies, we're starting to look at what are the false positives, what are the false negatives, what is also what are the flaws of existing systems? So for many years, we've used credit card access, but actually, if you looked at how equal, what is the equality of access to credit cards, it's not equal for everyone. Not everyone will have access to them. So I would say going forwards, a really interesting thing to look at would be what is the ease of circumvention of certain approaches? And there's a model that's used in the identity landscape where you say, what can I do as a bad actor or fraudster with 10 minutes, $10 and low skill versus say $100 to $200 a day and medium skill? Versus perhaps if I'm a paedophile or a committed fraudster, what can I do with a month, high skill, and $1,000? And you could put that sort of a framework into looking at circumvention for age assurance. So we're starting to look at that, I would say, if you look at some of the estimation approaches. But what we haven't really done is looked at the current approaches and pegged them side by side. And I think as we're starting to look at this with a scientific lens, we need to start to look at the whole range of approaches and be slightly critical as to what is good enough, and also look at it with that risk-based approach. We are, moving from a world where a 5-year-old has been able to tick a box and say I'm 13 or say I'm 18, and we have to now go forwards and look at, well, is an estimation approach more accessible? And is it okay that that is 1 to 1.5 years of inaccuracy versus just ticking a box and the 5-year-old ticking the box? It's not perfect, but if there's no documents, ID documents that somebody can access, is that more proportionate? So thankfully, there are lots of people attending this event today and remotely and in regulatory bodies that are considering this and weighing up those elements of accessibility and the different approaches. So to sum up, I do think that third-party sources can be useful. We need to look at them in the mix, and we need to be open to innovation, but also consider that re-authentication point, and also consider how easy approaches are to circumvent. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive analysis of the practical challenges here, and I'm conscious of time because we only have like 3 minutes left. But Shona, I would really love to hear from you, like from a legal perspective, the legal challenges, the accountability challenges when using third-party databases and when these are integrated into age assurance solutions. Could you talk us through these, like, well, in the time that we've got left, but it would be great to hear your views on this.
Sure, thanks, Katerina. Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes back to certainly accountability and the role of the parties. So we've seen certain third-party sources take the view that they're a processor, which of course can end up problematic for the customer, because if the customer is the only controller in the chain, they're going to have to assume responsibility for the whole of the processing, which they couldn't do in practice for the data that the third-party sources collected and compiled independently. From the age assurance service provided to the customer. Also kind of notwithstanding the view of the DPC that it's ultimately for the industry to continue to innovate in this area, it has underlined that age verification mechanisms developed and utilised, and I'll probably be sounding like a broken record, but must comply with the principle of data protection by design and by default, and must also be subjected to data protection impact assessments in order to assess whether that particular mechanism in question complies with the principles of data protection, and in particular, as Julie, you've underlined, data minimization, purpose limitation, storage, and security. And in terms of kind of that idea around data protection impact assessments, I suppose anecdotally we've seen supervisory authorities now requesting sight of data protection impact assessments conducted as to an organisation's choice and implementation of any particular age verification or age assurance mechanism. So being able to stand over the use of third-party data sources is really important, not just for the provider, but also for the ultimate organisation itself in its capacity as either controller or joint controller. And then finally, the kind of last point I want to touch on is lawfulness and further processing. So these third-party data sources may have collected the data for the specific purposes of age assurance, but in many cases, they may repurpose data that has already been collected in a different context for age assurance purposes. So there's a real need to ensure compatibility of those purposes. And also, if there's any reliance on consent, this can be very problematic for users under the age of consent. And all parties in the chain really need to consider that point. So there's a lot of food for thought, and probably we could spend much more time discussing it. But that's a whistle-stop tour.
Yes, that's indeed. There is it that needs like an hour of its own. But thanks, this has been like very comprehensive. And the key point is that the more parties are involved in the chain, the more challenging it becomes. There is a question as to how far accountability and due diligence efforts should go, both from the side of age assurance providers and also from the side of the customer of age assurance services. So it is a complicated topic. I understand this. I'm just conscious that we're running out of time, and I know that we had it on our agenda to discuss particular challenges in the context of machine learning, use of facial age estimation, but and it's a shame that we're not able to discuss this today, but I think this gives us a good opportunity to regroup and have like a separate session on this specific topic. So I would like to thank you very much for your contribution to this discussion, and thank you also for joining us today. Yes, and I'll just let you prepare the room for the next session then. Thank you.